Good afternoon and welcome to the CETA's members and guests for this program to honor over 22 million American veterans who have served our country in war and peace. And we owe these men and women and their families, all of whom have made many sacrifices in the defense of our nation. Now I'll ask you to rise, if you're able to do so, and join me in welcoming Lieutenant Clark and the Army ROTC Guard from UNC as they present our colors. Please remain standing as our own Dr. Davis Bingham, former director of the 8th Army Choir, and pianist Karen Cooper will lead us in the singing of the national anthem.
Left, right, colors, halt, carry, colors. Hold right, march, left, 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 right, 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 left, 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 right, 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 left, left, right, 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 left, colors, hold. Forward, march, left, 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 right, 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 left, left.
You may be seated. Thank you, Davis and Karen, and a special thanks to the commanding officer of the Army ROTC unit at UNC for making his men and women available for this afternoon. They had a great deal to tell us about celebration, and we appreciate their presence. I would also like to thank Bob Reckholz, who planned and set very high standards for previous Veterans Days observances, and also thank our CETA's Director of Activities, Tara Pierce, for her many contributions to the success of these CETA's events. I also want to personally thank my bride Ann and each of you in this audience for helping me fulfill a pledge I made to myself when I first discovered these letters about 30 years ago. At that time, I had no expectation that I would live to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Armistice Day. But if I did, I wanted to share with others my father's words about the special day in world history. And we're grateful today also to have that this program is being recorded by Brant Atkinson, who is a documentary video producer for North Carolina State University in Raleigh. And this is the college where my father and Brant's great-grandfather was in the ROTC that allowed him to be commissioned into the North Carolina National Guard and then later to serve in the U.S. Army in World War I. November 11th celebrations began as Armistice Day to celebrate the end of the Great War in 1918. It's now celebrated as Veterans Day to honor the service of all veterans in the U.S. and also now in many of the countries that were our allies in World War I and World War II, while Memorial Day in May honors those who gave their lives in military service. Our program today is in two related parts. First, we will recall how Americans in 1917 and 18 responded to our nation's call for arms after events led to the declaration of war by Congress on April 6, 1917. As many of you know, these events that led to the declaration included submarine sinkings of our ships and the intercepted Zimmerman telegram from the German government to the Mexican government, promising that Mexico would be awarded much of the southwestern U.S. if they supported the German side of this conflict. Specifically, in this first part of the program, we will briefly look at how an artillery battery of 170 enlisted men and 4 officers was recruited next door here in Durham and in adjacent counties, so some from Orange County, and then follow that group of soldiers as they transitioned from civilian life to military life, and they transitioned from the U.S. to battlefields in France. We will then recall what it was like for them on the front lines when the armistice occurred 100 years ago today at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. This story of the 113th Artillery was repeated around our state and the nation as other geographic areas similarly recruited and trained different units for the war. As the war progressed, many draftees from various parts of the country joined these original units. We will conclude this part of the program with a brief overview of what veterans have contributed to this nation for over 2 centuries and recall some specific contributions made by a few veterans to U.S. and North Carolina history. In the second part of the program, we will come home to honor the veterans of the Cedars with a roll call of their photos and branches of service. I do want to add one caveat in viewing this presentation. While veterans are the appropriate focus for this presentation, veterans have never represented the majority of our country's population and never will unless we adopt a policy of mandatory military service for all our young men and women. So we should never forget all those non-veterans who have served our nation in many essential capacities, including those mothers, wives, and other women who have made many sacrifices, but until recently have represented only a small portion of the veteran population. The Great War, called the War to End All Wars, as we all know, and only became known as World War I in the very late 1930s and 1940s as World War II began. And as you remember, this Great War was characterized by massive loss of lives with trench warfare, so that there were trenches that extended from Switzerland all the way in an unbroken group up to the North Sea. And it was characterized by trench warfare with massive loss of lives in the assault of these various defensive positions. For instance, the Battle of the Somme in 1916 resulted in hundreds of millions of casualties in a few days of the battle. A total of some 7 million soldiers and some 7 million civilians lost their lives in the World War I. And plus there were over 50 million deaths worldwide from the Spanish flu. As you may know, it was called the Spanish flu since Spain was a neutral in World War I, and they published the fact that they were going through a flu epidemic, whereas the warring parties didn't want to admit that they might have this epidemic that would make them weaker. So that's why we call it Spanish flu, although more recent scientific studies have shown that it probably originated in the Midwest of the U.S. and then spread throughout the world with the movement of troops and refugees all across the globe. Now, the American involvement in the World War I, or in the Great War, began on April 6, 1917, as we've said previously, when the declaration of war was declared by the U.S. Congress. General Pershing, who had been in the Army for a number of years, was picked as the commanding officer of what was called the AEF, or the American Expeditionary Force, that would go to France. The U.S. military grew from a very small standing army to over 208 million soldiers by the next year. And by mid-1918, over 1 million were already in France, and with about 10,000 arriving every day. And some of the ships that these troops rode on certainly couldn't compare with Queen Mary. They were cattle boats and many other things, but it got the people across there. And finally, the AEF had 53,000 battle deaths, 63,000 non-combat deaths, such as flu, and over 200,000 wounded. Now, these are fairly small numbers compared to the several million of French and English and German casualties in this war. But on the other hand, the fact that the AEF was in active combat only for 3 to 4 months shows what a price that the U.S. paid for that assistance in this war. Now, just to get from the general to the more specific, Battery C, the 113th Field Artillery, is shown in this picture, and all of these soldiers look like they're pretty much the same, but in the history of the 113th, they represented a wide variety of origins. This was first recruited from Durham and adjacent North Carolina the summers of 1917, so just several months after the war was declared. And by that time, the U.S. military people had decided it was better to start with National Guard units that were already formed and to recruit into them rather than establishing totally new units. And in North Carolina, there were, in addition to Battery C, or 6 batteries in the 113th, there were batteries, there were volunteer groups that included an infantry brigade, a cavalry squadron, 6 companies of coastal artillery, an ambulance company, and a field hospital. So across the state, and these were all volunteers before the draft started. And these soldiers first had some informal training in their home cities or home locations before they were entered into the war. And here you can see that it was in August of 1917 that the 113th Field Artillery was federalized as part of the 55th Artillery Brigade of the 30th Division in the U.S. Army. Their training occurred at Camp Sevier, South Carolina, which was basically at that point had not been developed as a camp, so a lot of the activity in the first few months was clearing grounds for parade grounds and for training grounds. And as you'll notice in this picture from the 113th history, they were drilling with wooden guns, and that this was supposed to be a 3-inch American gun with a gun limber, which was the term they used for the carriages that carried the shells to the front line. And a few of the officers, including my father, were trained at the U.S. Army Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which I understand is still in operation. I might stop to point out this is the emblem of the 113th. They're shiny, very bright emblems of this type, which are easy to find. And my nephew, who is an amateur military historian, and looked about 20 years to find this one, which would be the ones that would be worn during combat, because you wouldn't want to wear one of the shiny ones, which would give a target for your people that were firing at you. In May and June of 1918, the 113th left from the U.S. By a boat to go in a convoy through submarine-infested waters, went in port in England, then took a transportation across the Channel to France. Then they had an interesting experience there, that they did not bring the old artillery with them, but brought these but got new French 75s, and this shows one of these. This had a tremendous advantage over the previous artillery, because most of you have seen these pictures of battles at sea, or in the old days with the sailboats and the battles at sea, or in, say, the Civil War. And when you fired the artillery piece, it would recoil like this, the whole piece, so you'd have to move it back and reset it. This was designed as a recoilless, so it had a sort of a complicated system here where it would store the energy from the firing and then send it back. And also it was fairly lightweight, as you can see, compared to the big cannons that we've seen in many of the old pictures. And this fired a shell, the 75 millimeters, is almost exactly the same as a 3-inch. So it's about the diameter of a large container of jam or mayo or something. So it was fairly easy to deal with. And also, when they first arrived, they were spent about 2 months in Brittany, which, interestingly enough, was the artillery training school that Napoleon I had set up in the early 1800s, where the American troops were trained so they could actually have experience in firing this French 75 and becoming very precise in where they could place these explosives. And then while they were doing that training, part of the battery, the supply part, would recruit what my dad had said in one letter was a menagerie of 30 mules and 89 horses, which were requisitioned to pull these units into place. They did use motorized trucks to bring supplies and ammunition from ports and from munition factories behind the lines. But as they got nearer to the front line with the mud and the lack of real roads, they used the mules and horses to transport themselves, their supplies, and the guns. And then in September to November 11th, 1918, this unit and most of the units of the American forces were in almost continuous battle, and one of Pershing's philosophies was that he didn't want to just have the American troops go in and be replacements and for the people that had been lost in the European. He thought it would be much more effective if they went in as units, and so that they really had almost continuous activity for several months there that broke through the German lines and led to the the end of the war. Now, this is now checking it, going to the letter writer who wrote these letters. He was a student in agriculture at what is now North Carolina State University, but what then was called the North Carolina College for Agriculture and Mechanical Arts in Raleigh. And but while he was there, he was in the ROTC, so when he graduated in 1910, he was commissioned as a lieutenant, as you can see here, in the North Carolina, this probably doesn't show, but shows the North Carolina National Guard. And then at that time, he was in the infantry, which is the crossed rifles rather than the crossed cannons that are shown in later pictures. And this shows he is aged somewhat after about 6 or 8 years later, when he then got to France with his battery C of the 113, and this was his identification that all the soldiers had once they got to France. And this is a copy of some of the original items have been misplaced, but this is a copy in the Southern Historical Collection of one of the envelopes that he wrote to his mother and his wife, my future mother. And you'll notice that the soldiers' mail was free. They didn't have to have stamps. The YMCA donated the envelopes. It had the return address, which of course there was no geographic location because that could change daily. And in the future wars, the soldier would also put the his or her unique serial number. And then all of these were censored in case they fell into wrong hands, so that they wouldn't know where the soldiers were or where they'd been going. But as an officer, he could censor his own things. And this was his mother, who lived in a very rural area of North Carolina in Anson County near the South Carolina border, slightly east of Charlotte. So when Monday, November the 11th came, those on the front lines knew that negotiations had been going on between the Allies and the Germans about a possible armistice. But they could not yet fully appreciate the personal and international significance of this unique Monday in world history. He stated they slept restlessly and about 5 a.m. listened to the wireless, which that is a radio, and I'm not sure whether this was a French or English radio, at 5 a.m. for the news, but did not find out anything about the negotiations. Then the order came down about 6 a.m. on November the 11th that the armistice would go into effect at 11 a.m. And he wrote his mother that nothing, can you imagine anything more unique than standing by your guns, firing away for dear life, and knowing 5 hours in advance that the thing ended at 11 o'clock. And this shows one of the French 75s in battle firing, and they usually had about 4 men, one who pulled the trigger, if you will, the other one who re-aimed aimed at 2 others that were taking the shells shown here off of the ammunition carts, and so they could be very rapid firing of this. And in the meantime, the history said that while they were firing these shots, the Germans were firing high explosive and mustard gas shells back at them. And then I think this is the most interesting comment, that when it got to be very near 11, we took our watches and watched the second hand in the longest revolution any second hand ever made since such watches had been had such thing. Nobody wanted to be the last casualty in World War I. And I was able to find this watch on the internet for $500 if any one of you want to get one. But this was said to be a 1918 trench watch that was made in Waltham, Massachusetts. And all of the officers, and you could see it in that picture of my dad and his identification, had to have watches to synchronize for military attacks or whatever. And so I never saw the watch that he wore, but I suspected it was very similar to this. As 11 o'clock was reached, finally the noise stopped and our own guns were quiet. The men stood looking at each other in amazement. And then some fellow let out a real big Tar Heel yell, and pandemonium broke loose, as you can imagine. Rockets went up, pistols and guns were fired into the ground, and the men yelled and sang. So what a relief it was after 4 years of battle and many months for the Americans to be in battle. Then he commented that evening the defeated Germans were also ready to get home and stop this fighting, and so they sent up all their rockets, which prior to that time would have been used for signals or for lighting up the battlefield at night. So they sent up all their rockets, and so the whole horizon was ablaze with lights and colors, and it was very pretty. And he mentioned that the victorious men of the 113th went from making war to making fudge. So there was quite a change within that 24-hour period. He stated that then a great talking feast started, which will never stop. The Boers at the front lines did not know how it happened, and they will spend the remainder of their days trying to explain it. Why the armistice terms were accepted, and what brought Germany to their knees, and most importantly, when are we going home? And he also wrote to his wife that about 12 years from now, we will be sitting in our little hearth in Durham, Mary Louise, who was born, he was married just before he went on active duty, and she was born after he left for France. We'll open a history book and see something about November 11th. And she will wonder why this one day could be so important. And then I could tell her some interesting things about how the war ended on that day. After several months of anxious waiting to get called back to the port to return to the U.S., they were scheduled to return homeward. And this letter from, obviously a reproduced, not an original letter, but a letter with John Pershing's signature and addressed to each of the officers, said that remember that the bearing of their officers is reflected in the behavior and discipline of the men you are commanding homeward bound. I most sincerely trust that no single act may occur to stain the splendid records won by our troops in Europe. And so they then came back to Newport News, took the train from Newport News to Camp Jackson, South Carolina, where they were discharged in the, I think it was late March of 1918. But on the way, the train stopped in Raleigh, and the 113th had a parade down the main street of Raleigh, North Carolina, with the governor and the mayor and many dignitaries. And then you can see this, they still called them our boys. In fact, they've been through a lot, but they were our boys and our conquerors, and welcome back to us and to the U.S., and your conquests have saved the world. So that they got a warm welcome coming back. And after my father was discharged, he returned to his law practice in Durham, which he continued until 1933 and moved to Greensboro, and then practiced law and supported public university education in North Carolina until his death in 1968. So in summary about that story, I wanted to just briefly comment more generally now about the role of veterans in our history. That first, to thank the millions of veterans today and yesterday who have contributed so much to our history. They made the American experiment in democracy the most powerful and generous nation in history. They defended our nation and the free world against multiple tyrannies. And then they brought to their civilian lives leadership skills, decision-making, ability to work productively with other people, and a can-do teamwork to achieve common goals. And I wanted to just run through just several examples of this in U.S. and North Carolina history. First, looking at World War I veterans. As you may remember, Harry Truman, like my father, was a farm boy, and he went to France as a commanding officer of an artillery battery, and so had similar experiences to my father. I don't think they ever crossed paths, but he had similar experiences. But I think his experiences in making difficult decisions under stress served him well. As you remember, he suddenly became President of the United States in the spring of 1918 after Roosevelt's death. And he had to face the most momentous decision any new president has had to face in history. That is, were we going to drop the atomic bombs on Japan? And they knew that that would destroy several small communities and civilians, but it was balanced against the fact that an invasion of Japan had been scheduled for November, so the bombs dropped in August of 1942, and this massive invasion of the Japanese main islands was to start November 1st. And it was estimated that there would be over 1 million casualties in Japanese and Allied troops and civilians if this was carried out. So it was not an easy decision, but it was one that had to be made. And as such, he probably saved the lives of some of the people in this room, because some of our CEDAS veterans were already in the Pacific preparing for those that offensive invasion. And one of the members in the audience today had finished a month, 12 to 18 months in continuous fighting in Italy, was in the boat coming back to the U.S. when he got to the U.S. port, and there were people holding up signs saying the war is over. If the war had not been closed then, there would probably been another year of fighting in the Pacific, and no telling how many more casualties. The second World War I veteran, and I think is worth recognizing, is General George Marshall. During World War I, he was elevated to a colonel, and he was in France most of the time and did a lot of the training of the American troops as they came over and planning that last offensive. In World War II, he came back, he was in Washington and was appointed by Roosevelt to be the chief of staff of all of the U.S. military. He started at that with 4 stars, and then the 5 stars was created, and he was, I think, the first of the 5-star general, and just a very few have been appointed. And so he was responsible for the total organization and supervision of World War II. And then after that was over, he became the Secretary of State. Truman appointed him as Secretary of State, and that's when the Marshall Plan that many of us remember was put into effect. He had seen what happened after World War I when the Versailles Treaty was dividing the spoils of the victors and then making the defeated people miserable by all sorts of things, and he didn't want to see that continuing again. And so he did this Marshall Plan, which the American citizens helped fund the rebuilding of the German and Japanese communities, so that over the past decades they became a major part of the free world. And then finally, someone that we may not think of too much in this regard, but Frank Porter Graham was a Marine in 1917 and 18 for 2 years, and was on his way to Germany or France when the war ended, and unfortunately his brother was killed during that final offensive. But his training as a Marine and the can-do attitude he had served him well, as he very reluctantly became the president of the University of North Carolina in 1930, when at that point the Great Depression had descended upon the nation. The university was dependent almost entirely on appropriations from the legislature, which were first cut 25% and then 40%. And there were, other than the Keenan Fund, which provided very essential support for a few senior faculties, that meant that this faculty salaries were cut 25 and then 40%. And so Frank Grimm was the one who worked very hard for many years, but it was only about 1940 before the salaries were returned to the 1929 level. He also, when he gave his inaugural address as president in 1941, appropriately on Armistice Day, November 11th, he didn't say anything about the financial problems, but talked about the future of the university, and ended up with a quotation. Let me get it directly here, but ended up on a, just a minute, well, with the quotation that in the Keenan Stadium that day, there were representatives from all of the state public and private institutions, as well as the new private institution, which was Duke next door. And he said that rather than competing in antagonism, we should be competing in excellence and building here one of the great spiritual and intellectual centers of the world. So in a time when the whole world and the U.S. was depressed, he was putting forward this vision. Just two of very many World War II veterans who came back to this state. Both Terry Sanford and Bill Friday were North Carolinians who went off to war and came back with a determination to improve the life of the citizens of this state. And as you know, Terry Sanford was governor, then senator, and was the president of Duke University for 20 years and did much in terms of both general education in North Carolina and Duke, which of course is one of the three research units forming the Research Triangle. And Bill Friday was similarly was a great supporter of public education and helped strengthen and build the NC State and UNC as research institutions, so that today we have in the Research Triangle a unique, world-recognized, unique facility anchored by these three research universities, and where we now have 4 Nobel Prize winners, multiple other recognitions for these universities in our state. And in that transformation to the Research Triangle, North Carolina went from a transformation from an economy that was appropriate for the time, but was involved with the 3 T's. You grew tobacco and made cigarettes, or you grew textile, or you grew cotton and made textiles, or you cut timber and made furniture. And they were all very honorable professions, but they were not going to be competitive in today. Today we have a high-tech economy, and if you just look around the Research Triangle at all these research buildings and all the things that are going on, you can see the difference that has occurred, and these two people had a lot to do with that. And then I wanted to point out that Duke Hospital started in 1930 in the depths of the Depression, and Dave Davidson, the founding dean at Duke University Medical Center, was a veteran of World War I, and so they had to go through a very difficult time in being started in the Depression. Then when Memorial Hospital opened in 1952, it was listed as a continual memorial to those North Carolinians who have given their lives and who may in the future to protect the freedom and common welfare of their fellow citizens. Just like Duke opening in 1930, UNC Hospital had major burdens to bear when it opened in 1952. And in fact, one editorial writer in the Charlotte Observer, which would have liked to have had the hospital there, so this was natural and appropriate, said it was virtually an absurdity to build a teaching hospital in a community with 10,000 people, which was our permanent population with a few thousand more students. And when you looked at the situation, you almost wondered that if he wasn't right, because we only had 4 winding roads coming into Chapel Hill from the 4 directions, or 2-lane roads. Of course, there was no helicopter transportation. The whole appropriation, the whole funding of the university hospital was based on state appropriations, and the state board of budget bureau would call every day or so to see what the census and the money that the hospital had done. But one of the things, and I was here when it first opened, and then I and 2 other faculty, retired faculty, went back and did some historical works on this. But I'm now convinced that it was the World War II veterans that had a great deal to do with the success of this hospital, which many of you use, and even if you don't, it's part of this area here. And the first house staff, that is the interns and residents, were predominantly veterans. And one of the people in here is Woody Coley, and many of you know where's Ruby, who's his widow is here. And Woody went on from his training here to be a pioneering pediatrician in eastern North Carolina to bring good health care to the people of eastern North Carolina. And also the faculty, before the hospital was opened and expanded, the total faculty of the medical center was probably 20 or 30. It increased by several hundreds in those first few years, and now it's about 1,400, I just learned the other day. But one of the people in the initial faculty is this young man right here, which is our friend John Spitznagel. And John was in the military for 13 years, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, decided to get out when his next appointment would have made him an administrator who couldn't do clinical work. So he came here and was a great success both as a researcher and as a clinician. And so with those announcements, then I would like to go to the honor roll of CEDA's veterans. These are ones that we've taken, or that Tara has taken the pictures of many of the veterans that we'll show you, of all of the living veterans we'll show you, organized by their service, and then the ones that have passed away in a second part of this. So just we'll go through this and see these people. We'll have a chance to As we conclude this ceremony, I would like those who are able to stand and give a standing ovation to those veterans who are in our midst today, and for all of those veterans who are in our memories of yesterday. Thank you very much for attending.